The gospel, the gospel, the gospel, the gospel, the gospel, the gospel. How'd you like that intro? That's what 1 Corinthians 9 really is all about. It's all about the gospel, which is what Jesus is all about. It's what the Father is all about. It's what we should be all about. So Paul is talking to the believers in Corinth, and he just got done explaining to them about their liberty in Christ, and really he kind of ends with this point, is that he does everything in such a way to advance the gospel. So something's going to be a hindrance to the gospel, he's going to remove it so it isn't a hindrance to the gospel, because the gospel is what is most important. People need salvation. They need Jesus. So, before we get into it, this is the gospel. God is completely holy, totally separated from all sin. He is totally pure, and he requires that only holy people live with him, a holy God. We, human beings, are not holy. We have sin. We have a ton of sin, and therefore we cannot possibly be with this holy God. There's no amount of good that we can do to get rid of the sin that we have. So we need total forgiveness. And the good news, this is the gospel, the good news is that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came to earth in the form of a man, died on a cross of his own will, paid for all of our sin, and then rose from the dead. And he said that anyone who trusts in the payment that he made on their behalf is then forgiven of all of their sin, past, present, future sin completely, and they will spend eternity in the presence of God, being made holy, not by their good works or by their actions or reformed life or anything like that, but being made holy only by God, who has given them righteousness as a gift when they put their trust in Christ's payment for their sin. That's the gospel. That's what Paul's talking about. So here he goes on to defend himself, because some of the believers in Corinth were saying, Paul, he didn't receive any or require any financial support from us. Is he really an apostle? And so he defends himself. He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Which literally an apostle is one who is sent on a mission by God. And there's two uses of the word apostle in the New Testament. One is there's specific men that have the office of apostle given to them by Jesus, and there's certain requirements for that office of being an apostle, being a sent one sent on this mission to really start the church. And there's certain requirements, like they had to see Jesus risen, they had to spend time with him under his teaching, and so on. And then there's also the use of apostle is just anyone who is sent on the mission of spreading the gospel by God. And so others fit into that. Like in this chapter, Paul will refer to Barnabas. And if you remember Paul and Barnabas, they went on that first missionary journey together through the region of Galatia. And he is called an apostle here. So essentially the idea really is a missionary. Not so much a pastor, but more so a missionary, because one who is sent on a mission. So Paul says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord Jesus? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. He came to them, preached the gospel. Many of them became believers. He established the church there. And so he fulfilled his mission in preaching the gospel and discipling them. So his point is he's a true apostle. Paul is a true apostle. He says, my defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas is Peter? Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working? Who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? So you see his point he's getting across here is apostles have rights. They have the right to marry. They have the right to receive financial support. And this is just a biblical principle extending from the Old Testament to where if you did work, whatever type of work you were doing, you had a right to receive some of the fruit of that work. So just like an ox would do the work of plowing a field, it would have a right to the food that was produced from that particular crop. Interesting here, he says Peter has a wife, Now, the Roman Catholic Church claims that, clergy should not marry. That actually came from, I think it was Pope Gregory, and he was the 10th, Pope Gregory the 10th, who basically put forth the idea that clergy should not marry. It is not biblical at all. Peter had a wife. Most likely Paul had a wife at some point in his life. So missionaries, apostles, they have rights to take a wife. They also have a right to receive financial support from those that they have led to Christ and discipled, and it's from churches that they have established. I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does not the law also say these things? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? Or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? So his point is apostles have the right to marry, receive financial support, and he's using scriptures from the Old Testament to make his point. Even ox have the right to the fruit of the land that they have worked hard to produce. Nevertheless, now he's going to shift here to a different point. He says, nevertheless, we did not use this right. So Paul had a right to these things as an apostle, or a missionary really, but he didn't use this right. Well, why not? But we endure all things so that we will cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. But I have used none of these things, and I am not writing these things so that it will be done so in my case. For it would be better for me to die than to have any man make my boast an empty one. So here he refers to another example of this principle. He goes to the priests in the temple, in the Jewish temple, and they would perform the sacrifices and take care of the temple, and as a result, the people of Israel would support them financially. And so he then links this principle to those that preach the gospel. They should get their living from the gospel. They should be financially supported because they're investing all this time and energy in preaching the gospel and discipling people, which is a lot of work. And so they have the right then to receive financial support. But his point here shifts to this idea that he did not use that right. And the reason is because it may have been a hindrance to the gospel. If Paul went to Corinth and he said, he proclaimed the gospel, and then he said, hey, listen, you guys should financially support me, he may have been accused of just being out for money. And it could have been a hindrance to them coming to Christ and growing in him. So he did not use this right. And so it's good to forgo these rights so the gospel is not hindered. Paul's objective is that the gospel would go forth and people would come to Christ. If there's something that's going to hinder that, including his own financial, status, even his living being affected, then he will let his living be affected. He will go and work extra hard in order for the gospel to not be hindered. This does not speak of, in any way, financially or vocational ministry. This doesn't speak of pastors being given pay in order to be full-time vocational pastors. It has been used that way. Perhaps it can be applied to that. However, it's just not what Paul is talking about here. He's talking about more so apostles, those that are missionaries, than he is pastors. It wasn't even a thought in Paul's mind or in the first century that pastors or elders or shepherds, all the same thing, in the churches of his day, which this is the beginning of the church, it was not even a thought that they would be full-time supported or that they would be vocational pastors. Everybody worked. The leaders worked, the pastors worked, and he himself worked. But his point, it isn't even about vocational pastors at all. His point is only about apostles and missionaries, and his point here is that it is good to forego the right to receive financial support so that the gospel is not hindered. To Paul, it's all about the gospel going forward. That is what is most important. That's the goal. So everything else that he chooses to do or not do is going to fall in line with his goal of the gospel going forth, people coming to Christ. And he says, "For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." In other words, he is obligated to preach the gospel because of what Christ has done for him. "For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward." Will be rewarded for preaching the gospel. We're given heavenly rewards. "But if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. What then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as to not make full use of my right in the gospel." So Paul sees him preaching the gospel as an obligation. He's been entrusted with a stewardship. A stewardship is kind of like being a manager of somebody else's property. And so he's obligated by Christ to preach the gospel. But also voluntarily, if he does it voluntarily, which he does because out of gratitude for Christ and love for Jesus, he preaches the gospel. If he does it voluntarily, then he will receive a reward. And it's the same with us. So it is absolutely necessary for us to preach the gospel, and if we do it with the right heart, we'll be rewarded for it. Those heavenly rewards when we finally see Jesus. Then Paul says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, so I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, as without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without the law." Talking about Gentiles, without the Old Testament laws. "To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it." Here's his point, is Paul becomes like those he's trying to reach. Become like those he's trying to reach, and we need to do the same. If people are not comfortable coming to our church, then we go to them. What do they like to do? They like to go bowling, become a bowler. They like to eat Chinese food, eat Chinese food. They like to watch movies, go to a movie with them. Get in their world. Christians are to go out and become like those they're trying to reach. More so in culture or in practice or in lifestyle, not in worldliness or sin, of course. But this is what the idea is behind being missional, is becoming like those you're trying to reach in order to reach them and remove all obstacles to the gospel. If it's an obstacle for someone to receive Christ, if inviting them to church and them having to come into a church culture that they don't understand, everything's unfamiliar, we have different terminology and all that, and that is going to prevent somebody from coming to Christ, then that needs to be removed, meaning that can't be our only game plan. We have to be willing to become like those we're trying to reach and get into their world and represent Christ in their world. Finally, he says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath." They would receive a wreath around their head. "But we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." What is he talking about here? Well, he's using an analogy. In Corinth, they had something like the Olympic Games. It wasn't the Olympic Games, it was their own sporting event, but it was like that. It was a big set of games of sport that they would do, and they would have races, and the one that would win would get a wreath around their head as a prize. And of course, these athletes trained very hard in order to attain their goal. And so Paul's saying that his goal is to preach the gospel, to lead people to Jesus. And so he disciplines his life and structures his life in such a way to accomplish that goal. So whatever that requires, he's going to do because that's his goal. So in the same way for us reaching people for Christ, it requires a disciplined life. We have to not only discipline ourselves to make sure we have time with God, because we can't pour out to anybody that something that we have not received, or if we're not connected with Christ, we can do nothing. So we have to be disciplined with our time with God, our time with other believers, to where we're being built up and encouraged and strengthened and trained within the church community. And then our time, we need to make sure that we are investing time in people's lives and reaching them for Christ and discipling them. And we need to make sure that we discipline in the area of money, so that we are, self-sustaining. We're paying our bills, but we're also investing money in the kingdom. And discipline in our relationships, making sure our marriages are healthy, our children are healthy, our relationship with our children are healthy, because that's the foundation for any kind of ministry. So reaching people for Christ requires a very disciplined life. And Paul says, I don't want to be disqualified. It doesn't mean that he's afraid of losing his salvation, but he's afraid of losing his place of service. So let's sum it all up here. Paul is a true apostle. Apostles have the right to marry, receive financial support. It's good to forego these rights so the gospel is not hindered, however. It's necessary for us to preach the gospel. Become like those you're trying to reach, and reach people for Christ requires a disciplined life. So, with all that, make it your aim, your goal, to invest in somebody who doesn't know Jesus this week. Spend some time with them. Become like those that you're trying to reach. And pray for them, love them, serve them, and look for opportunities to share